Lawrence Hedges is the founding director of Newport Psychoanalytic Institute, where he currently serves as supervising and training psychoanalyst. He is a director of the Listening Perspective Studies Center and is in private practice specializing in training psychotherapists in Orange, California. Dr. Hedges is an instructor in psychology and psychoanalysis at CGI, California Graduate Institute. He holds a faculty appointment at the University of California at Irvine Medical School, Department of Psychiatry. He is author of numerous papers in the following psychotherapeutic texts: Listening Perspectives in Psychotherapy, Interpreting the Countertransference, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through Childhood Trauma, In Search of the Lost Mother of Infancy, Strategic Emotional Involvement, and Working the Organizing Experience. To say the least, your next speaker is quite prolific, and I think you will enjoy listening to him a lot. Dr. Hedges.
Thank you, Leslie, very much. It's my job to take us deeper inside of ourselves. That is, around this whole question of risk and the perils of the psychotherapeutic relationship. There are many different angles to the question and to the problems, but as a psychoanalyst, I'm interested in deep transferences, as most of you already know. Bob and Virginia and I met together for dinner on Wednesday night, just to put our heads together to think about today and just see where are we with this. We've been thinking about it for a long time. And as I left, went back home, I was troubled by something that I haven't been able to formulate yet, haven't been able to represent. Like in this whole question of false accusations, of perils, of the dangers of intimacy that Bob talked about, we're aware that on the one hand we have many people living in our society who have been abused in all manner of ways and who are abused by therapists. On the other hand, we have a lot of things that happen to people that weren't necessarily deliberate, perpetrated abuse, but were traumatic. In many ways in which that deep trauma, going back to before birth, may have its mark on psyche and then be experienced later in ways that are not literally true, so that we have memories coming up that are metaphorically true of traumatic events, but those memories of traumatic events have to be represented in some way. And I'll talk about the archetypes that the unconscious tends to choose in order to represent deep trauma. Right at this interface of real abuse, real intrusion, and fantasies that are constructed to tell of trauma, there's some interface area, and at the most superficial question is, did it happen or didn't it? But by the time we get down deeper, was a person hurt or weren't they? When the therapist hugged a person in this way, did she feel sexual? Did he feel sexual? Was that okay? Was it worked through? If it wasn't worked through, was that okay? There's a lot of detailed questions on this interface for which there are no clear answers. I woke up at 5 the following morning feeling like, what's the dilemma? Where are we really at peril? With the following dream. The dream begins immediately following a symposium in which I had been holding forth in some way. Was it a symposium on love, or the inevitability of desire, or the perils of intimacy? A young man approached me, a boy man, maybe 14, maybe 16. And in the wordless, silent communication of dreams, he made known to me his great need, his hunger, his desire. He needed a mentor, a guru, a guide, an elder. I felt a stirring within me, a swelling in my maternal breasts and belly, and in my paternal loins. I had been chosen. I felt conflict, fear, and desire. And I felt the watchful eye in the periphery of a father. His father? A father. The father. The father's? My father? Sensing my or the bog. Freud tells us that racial minority references in dreams often are a downward displacement of conflicts upward with the father that cannot be settled. So that if we're working on a father conflict, it ends up being represented down the social hierarchy ladder with a racial minority to which the unconscious assumes to be somehow inferior. And so here, the conflict is with the rules, the laws of the fathers, being blocked on the high road, feeling seduced into the low road, and being caught right between. The dream and its context suggest to me that the perils of the intimacy of the therapeutic relationship are related to feeling caught between being blocked by the cultural father authority, the rules of psychotherapy, the ethics, and the structure, and the feelings that we feel endangered by as we begin to move towards merger and fusion with the mother body. Perhaps the epigram at the end of the dream should read, with all of the cultural wisdom and pronouncements of the fathers, you'd think that by now we would have some clear notion about how to pass through mother territory without getting bogged down in loss of boundary and merger. When is the trust relationship itself a boundary violation? We think we know what boundaries are. We think we know what a trust relationship is. We think we know how we should conduct ourselves. But when and under what circumstances does the other experience boundaries in a different place than we do ourselves? I think I must have been preparing for this dream because last week I spent quite a bit of time writing a paper, a book review of a science fiction novel by the Polish author Stanislaw Lem. Some of you may know his work. The title of the book is Fiasco. So by the title you can tell where the end is. It's set several centuries from now. The question of human intelligence in other galaxies is now settled. It's now known that there have been, in the course of time, many intelligent civilizations. The main problem is that as the scholars have studied this, there is a brief window of time in which it would be possible to contact another intelligence. The reason for this is not clear. The history of intelligent civilizations is they slowly rise. There's about a 200 or 300 century window of a technological era in which the civilization is signaling its presence into the universe, and then suddenly the signals go silent. There's all sorts of questions about why the civilizations apparently disappear. Do they enter a super civilization? Do they enter a level that we don't understand, a super mega intelligence? Or do they self-destruct? Do they have wars among other intelligences? No one knows. But after all of the great controversies over the globe have taken place, the decision by Earth is we will send a mission to Quinta, a civilization which, given the black hole that exists between us and Quinta, in a 43-year mission, a ship could be sent across the black hole, whipping around the rim and back in a 43-year period to make contact with Quinta, so named because it's the fifth planet from its own sun. And so the mission begins using materials, crystalline materials from Titan, a moon of Saturn. And somehow in this we have a series of weird flashbacks that only Lem is capable of giving us. Those of you who haven't read Lem, his book Mortal Engines is the one of the all-time best-selling science fiction books, a series of short stories. His forte is defining a certain aspect of human intelligence and then mechanizing it, that is, dehumanizing it, putting it into robots or some sort of a mechanical civilization, and then watching it grind to its logical end until suddenly we're horrified with that particular aspect of our intelligence and how it operates. And so in this book, he's obviously studying connection. How does one intelligence reach out and find and communicate with another? Well, the ship is a mile long. It's got several hundred people aboard, and there's a landing module with 10 people, and finally, one man will walk Quinta before the mission returns. We have a 3D video flashback to a strange story back in America Southwest several centuries ago, where there is a crystal in a cave that seems to govern the intelligence of the North American natives. And yet, as the white overlords appear in their quest for the treasured crystal, they manage to destroy not only the crystal, but the entire civilization governed by the crystal. There's another story that takes place on the moon of Saturn, Titan, where there is a great crystalline civilization believed by humans to be non-living, but which managed to devour a group of humans that were all frozen instantly in the wasteland of there. And it turns out to be Lem's favorite hero from his other stories, Perks, who was frozen. And so these apparently non-living, non-intelligent beings on Saturn were destroyed to make the ship. In another story, an explorer goes in the desert in search of the secret of a large termite civilization. And after going through miles and miles of mounds and mounds of complex termite edifices, the center is located, and at the center, a crystal, which he steals, and soon disappears. The crystal vanishes. And so the mission goes forward. And there are all the talks about how do we actually talk to another. And so then we begin to see, much like we were reliving human history from the beginning of time, of one civilization encountering another, we begin to see how the communication begins. And it's rocky, and it's strange, and it's clear that the Quintans know that we're here. They know that we are powerful, and they don't want us here. They want us to go away. Why? And so one question after another. My favorite character in it is a representative of the Vatican, because of course the question has been all along, are souls in other intelligent civilizations saved? And generally the ex-cathedra pronouncement was, if God could make a revelation here, he could make revelations elsewhere. So that problem was solved. Finally, much against all cryptic messages from the Quintans, the landing module goes and Perks walks Quinta. Nothing that they've been able to, no message, nothing they've seen, nothing they've heard has made any sense at all. And he's now walking in a wonder world that Lem proceeds to describe, lost in a reverie. But as Perks gets lost in the reverie, not having the slightest idea of how to understand what he's seeing, he forgets to check back in with the ship. And by this time, Earthlings are so frustrated with the lack of response coming back from the Quintans in a way that makes sense, that when he fails to respond according to time, the huge laser beam of the ship aims towards the planet to completely destroy it. And on the last page of the book, Perks looks in the blinding flash of total destruction and sees the Keatons. And at that instant, I'll save you all so you can read the secret of the Keatons. Perks sees why we could never have understood them, and why everything that they ever did was their desperate attempt to tell us about themselves, and why, inevitably, our wish to merely communicate with them would destroy them, and they knew it. And they are destroyed by consciousness, by intelligence. And I think it is our consciousness as psychologists, psychotherapists, that moves into a psychotherapy situation trying to do psychotherapy or psychodiagnosis or whatever. And the question is, what kinds of destruction, what kinds of boundary violations are going to occur without our even knowing it, that are going to be hurtful, damaging, neglectful, abusive. And we can say we're innocent. And maybe by law and ethics we can get by, but maybe we can't. So somewhere in this interface, there's a question of, does the trust relationship itself, do the laws and ethics which govern psychotherapy, do our assumptions about the nature of human beings, to what extent do they represent a dominant consciousness structure of a particular group of people who are living on the planet at this point in time, and to what extent does that consciousness structure run the risk of invading and destroying other consciousnesses? So to me, that is really a question that is overarching all of our various considerations. Let's, I want to move into the main part of my talk. You've got a handout in front of you. Fortunately for me, most of the areas on the beginning part of the talk have already been covered by other speakers. The first part, it can't happen to me. I hope by this point in the day, no one here thinks that. It can happen to you. And as we go into looking at the transferences that produce accusations and what I'm going to label a false accusation, so far as I know, we have no way of knowing at this point in time when, where, or how to identify in advance the kind of transference or the way in which a particular transference might work so that an accusation is aimed at us, and we certainly don't know how to estimate or to know how, when our very presence in this person's life may be a boundary violation, regardless of how ethical we are being in the process. It can happen to us. A false accusation I've chosen to define arbitrarily as simply an accusation in which there is no clear-cut causal evidence which proves that the damage sustained by the accused was in fact caused by actions or inactions of the accuser. Follow it? We don't have a direct cause and effect link, and we can't prove it. And so it comes back really to a question of proof, corroborating evidence, but in the long run, this is about the best we can do in terms of what might qualify as a false accusation. So what I want to talk about are not accusations where we know that people are lying, where we know that they have a motive for money or whatever. The false accusations that I've had a chance to look at, being an expert witness and through my work in consultation groups over the last 7 or 8 years when this has become a problem, the kind of accusations I've had a chance to look at are the ones where the client really believes that the therapist has done something or not done something that has been very damaging and very hurtful. And so whether this accusation remains within the context of the psychotherapy situation, whether a third-party consultant is brought in to begin helping to mediate or resolve any accusation, or whether the accusation in one way or another begins to spill out into the society at large, whether to an ethics committee, a licensing board, or a civil court, at all levels there, with that accusation, what is going on? Now, let me make clear what we've already heard many times today. We know that for 10,000 years, there's been far more abuse going on than any of us would like to think, and that the veil of denial has just been lifting, and so there are plenty of therapists who have certainly crossed boundaries they shouldn't have crossed and who have been disciplined appropriately. What I'm mostly concerned about is when a therapist has been conducting his or her life in an average expectable way, stirring up transferences, and something in the transference causes an accusation to be aimed at the therapist, which could be very destructive to the therapist. How do we begin to understand the nature of that process? The broader context is going to have to do something with this theme that's also been a part of today of recovered memories in psychotherapy, because only a year or two ago you saw me standing at this very same podium talking about recovered memories. And in that one, what you were hearing me say was that so many of these recovered memories are going to be traceable back to infantile trauma. That is, whether it's fetal alcoholic syndrome, an incubator, surgery, a psychotic mother, a depressed mother, a family in distress, a Holocaust conditions, starvation, rats in the barrio. It doesn't matter what the nature of the infantile trauma was. The question is, how is it remembered? And the answer is, it can only be remembered as a physical experience, a body experience. We don't know quite where it's meaningful to talk about the difference between mind and body, but certainly not so much back in utero or during those earliest months of life. The experiences that are remembered, recorded, are recorded in the body tissue, in the kind of contractions that Virginia was talking about today, and that Bob was, and that certainly in the first year of life, the body is going to be the recorder. And so 40 years later, someone wants to know, I know there's some damage down there. I was hurt in some way. I can't maintain intimate relationships in a way that other people can. I know there's something wrong. And so whether through pentothal, hypnosis, psychotherapy, the person begins to search, they go down, 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 and what do we come up with? Well, we know from our own dreams every night that we're very creative in our dreams. The human mind is designed to create symbols, and the human intelligence will try to account for things. And so in trying to account for something that the person knows went wrong somewhere and has left scars and damage, but it cannot be remembered in a way that, say, a 5 or 6-year-old child might be able to remember something, right? The mind begins to create thoughts and images. And the thesis that I took on it, that's present in the book up here today, Remembering, Repeating, and Working Through Childhood Trauma, I then looked at the standard archetypes that tend to appear in these accusations. We've talked about them already today. The cult abuse ones, the satanic ones. It interested me at one point to read, actually in a Christian magazine, that 95% of the cases of satanic ritual abuse come from fundamental Christian homes, which could tell us something about where the sense of ritual is. In these homes, the devil is real. In these homes, there is a certain community in which many children that come to our practices felt sold down the river by their parents to the beliefs, the rituals, the doctrines, and the creeds of the group around them. So the whole satanic ritual scene begins to unfold in a way that's clearer. The best story, by the way, is best account of it that I've read is Nathaniel Hawthorne. Do you know young Goodman Brown? 1854, I believe. And Nathaniel Hawthorne wrote this wonderful story, and here's Nathaniel Hawthorne's interpretation of satanic ritual abuse. Young Goodman Brown, on the day of his marriage, but before his marriage is consummated, suddenly realizes that he has had an appointment to keep that he's been putting off for some time, an appointment with someone in the woods. And so he starts off in the woods, and slowly he is joined by the mysterious presence, and they walk together with this sort of Dr. Faustus kind of conversation. And before too long, various other people from the village, the town gossip, okay, soon the minister, and finally the governor's wife join him, and they're all going through the forest until at last in the clearing, the giant fires, the pyres, almost the entire village of people, and the altar laid out. And who does he see standing across the circle, across the pyre, directly in front of him? His new bride. That's Nathaniel Hawthorne's interpretation of satanic ritual abuse fantasies. That it has something to do with the terror of sexuality. Another archetype has to do, of course, with abductions. We don't have alien abductions really in this culture until immediately after the atomic bomb. And then we have one after the other until now we have 3 or 4 million people who are willing on a Roper Foundation survey to acknowledge some sort of hard or soft contact with aliens. The story has evolved, it's now archetypical, but we've had abductions since the beginning of time. There's always some tribe coming across the mountains or down the river or across the ocean to steal our babies, make our wives pregnant, to enslave us in some way or another. And so alien abductions just happens to be the latest version of a time-honored theme. It's interested me to discover that not one Chinese has been taken aboard a spaceship. Now, I don't know if that means the aliens are racist. On the other hand, 50% of all Brazilians report having had some contact with aliens. And so by the time we begin to study it cross-culturally, we can realize that it is a very powerful archetype and it works differently in different cultural groups. Incest, of course, is the oldest, the most widespread of human horrors. And so if we want to talk about the worst crime that all cultures of all time have referred to in one way or another, it has to do with incest. And so we have that archetype. We've already talked about the Bridie Murphy past lives, another one. I lived here before, and in this past life I was in some way or another traumatized or hurt. So that all these archetypes give the human mind, the dreaming mind, the imagination, the possibility of trying to represent in visual imagery and in story and in narration what my terrible infantile trauma was about. And so in my paper, Taking Recovered Memories Seriously, what I maintained was believing these memories isn't to take the person seriously. We must take the person seriously and then begin to explore them. And you've heard a variety of opinion today on ways that we might go about exploring them and staying firmly within the role of a psychotherapist. So that recovered memories then take us into the way that psychoanalysts have looked at memories through time. Freud in 1912 talked about screen memories. His idea was basically that in therapy all the time we hear these strange memories that come from the people's past. The memories usually come immediately after a transference interpretation. And as the memory is there, the analyst may be inclined to think, well, since it came after a transference interpretation, it might be true. But Freud said the truth is not an issue with these memories. Sometimes they did happen, sometimes they did not. The important thing is that they capture a subjective truth of the person. And so it's as though a whole atmosphere of a child's life during that period becomes projected onto a screen as a memory. And so that screen memory lives to tell a story of an emotional experience, and the memory itself might or might not be factually true, and the truth or falsity of the literal quality is not what's in question. Freud's point was the screen memory tells our truth. Telescope memory is Heinz Kohut's version of the screen memory, only he says it's like a handheld telescope that collapses. Often we will first of all begin to hear a theme appearing. Someone will say, well, I can remember something that happened in the back seat of a car when I was in high school. And then before too long, there were several of us kids, under the back porch. And then, so we have a series of things, and we finally begin to realize that there is a life theme that is being collapsed over time, so that there's a series of slices out of that timeline that might exist as visual memories or auditory, some form of memory, but that what is happening is each one of those is a condensation of a theme that runs through time, so that they also tell a story of our own psychic history. The narrational truths have become a very important part of psychotherapy today, in that originally we thought, well, maybe if we just are careful enough, we can either go back and get the true history, or we can reconstruct what actually happened back in childhood. I think few people actually believe that anymore. We're realizing that life is too rich and too many things happen to us. But we begin to look at psychotherapy as a storytelling experience, that people begin to tell the story of their life. Donald Spence and Roy Schaefer are fond of pointing out that the greatest human truths of all times have been known through stories, myths, archetypes, and fairy tales. And so what we have then, we all know that we do it, we collect a set of stories about ourselves. My favorite example is the divorce. All right, as we approach the divorce, he has a set of stories he gives, and she has a set of stories that she has. Then as the crisis and conflict and separation occurs, there's another cascading set of stories, one for your boss, one for your child, one for your mother, one for the man next door. Okay? And then 2 months later, we have another set of stories, and 3 years later, 30 years later, well, many of these stories contradict one another. Not at all coherent. What we realize is it's the nature of our life. The nature of our life is it's rich, it's many-faceted, and we tell stories to someone with a goal and a purpose of trying to enhance our communication with that particular person. So we go to a psychotherapist to tell the story of our life so that we can at last figure out how we were screwed up and how we're going to get better. Well, already that's a very strong structure. And you all know from your TAT training that stories have rules. That is, in this culture, you can't just walk in and go mumble, mumble, mumble. You got to have a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, right? Remember the rules? We got to have characters that are plausible, with plausible motivations and interactions. We've got to have finally a crisis to the story, a denouement, and a coming down from it, and it's all got to hang together seamlessly. Well, by the time we're 4 or 5 years of age, most of us begin to tell stories fairly much according to cultural prescription, and certainly by the time we later come to psychotherapy, we can tell a good story. And so the requirements of narration force whatever our body, soul experience is into certain kinds of templates. So we have archetypes that serve to represent the unrepresentable. We have the requirements of narration. We have the problems of memory, all of which go into letting us know that anybody who thinks you're going to get any facts in a psychotherapy office is a fool. Okay? We're going to get an experience there. Okay? Something wonderful may happen, but it's going to be rich with diversity, rich with possibilities. I always thought that was the mistake of the Watergate problem, was breaking in, thinking you're going to find something in a psychotherapy office that made sense. I worry about attorneys, Brandt, thinking that these things are true. Okay. Let's move into the kinds of transferences, because, as you know, transference is really the kind of memory that we're always looking for in psychotherapy. Many schools of psychotherapy do not use the word transference anymore, but it doesn't matter. We all use it anyway, whether you're talking about the inner child, parent tapes, adult tapes, whatever. We're talking about emotional experiences that come from relationships in the past that become a part of us that get transferred into the present. And so it's a simple behavioral formulation that Freud fundamentally came up with initially, but Freud was interested, because of his own self-analysis, in the transference that first happened at about age 5, the so-called Oedipus transference. thought I had that. Well, we'll look here. That is, at age 5, when Freud was trying to formulate an idea of neurosis, he began to see that at age 4 and 5, the problem of triangular relationships in the family and in life was the emotional problem that every child was working on. Who is who to whom? If you're my father and you're my mother, and there's a triangle here between us, how does that work? And every little 4 and 5-year-old is trying to figure this stuff out. So I know that when I'm with you, we have formed a certain kind of relationship, and I know how I can be powerful with you, and it's fine until he walks in. Now, we both have a relationship with him. We both love and hate him. The ambivalence of the Oedipus stage is possible, but our relationship changes when he walks in. And when I'm having a relationship with my father, there's a certain kind of relationship, and it changes the minute she walks through the door. And when they go in the bedroom door and lock it, castration. It's the meaning of castration, an unfortunate term, but it had meaning at the turn of the century that it doesn't quite carry with it today. The idea of a loss of power, feeling injured by the loss of power in the triangle. We all know that triangles are the most unstable of human relationships. We always feel endangered by 3-way relationships, and we know why. And so whatever the fears of competition, the fears of succeeding, so that if I have my mother and shut him out, that's the model of incest. Success in the Oedipal competition is the incest model. Failure would be, she gets him, and I'm left out, and I'm hurt and crushed. Or the inverse, whichever way it wants to go. So our fears of failure and success in competition come from this level. And so this is a level that we take into the psychotherapy situation, and it's a level we've been studying many years without too many difficulties, and it's an area which, whatever happened at ages 4 and 5 and 6, in an ordinarily developed child can be remembered fairly vividly and lived out in the neurotic transference. By the time we move down to the 3-year-old level, we're talking about the transference that Coe has talked about, the narcissistic transferences, the self-object transferences, that with my mother I need myself mirrored, and so I'm always coming in, see me, see me, see me, see how wonderful I am. I need to then project that grandiose self onto someone, but since I've already established that she's a witch, I project it onto my father because he's a little further away, and so he's the best daddy in the world and drives the biggest car and can beat up your daddy. Okay? So the idealization is the projection of the grandiose self. So these kinds of transferences that come from the 3-year-old level are the one in which there's an immediate emotional demand on the therapy process and upon you to like me, to say what I'm doing, to give me good feedback, and to make me feel worthwhile before I leave here this afternoon. Will you do that?
How much are you going to pay for it?
Ah! She wants to know the fee. Okay. By the time we move down to the second level of what we call borderline or symbiotic level of transference, once again, there are transferences that we know about fairly well. All of our people that come in with major character arrests, whether their symptoms are in the addiction area or the eating area, whether there's a sociopathy, whatever the symptom picture is, still there is a style of relating to the mother other that is retained in the personality. So sometimes we wondered, well, what exactly is a borderline? That's been a question. And if you know, then you're the only person on the planet, because we don't know what a borderline looks like because we don't know what a mother-child relationship looks like. There's a million ways a mother-child bonding at the 4 to 24-month-old period looks like. It has many different facets, and it looks many different things. So the question is, how is a particular mother-child combination stuck to where this is the way to relate, and so long as you're relating this way, it's good, and you're my baby, but if you relate that way, it's bad, and I don't like you. So we see the so-called splitting of the affects, and the splitting of the affects is based upon, are you doing this relationship right, or are you not? And all mother-baby combinations have their various rules. And the rules of relating are the ones that we retain. And for those of you that are interested in the addictive aspect of it, it's of course always interesting that people tend to have a certain pattern of going after a certain substance, whether that substance is television, cocaine, alcohol. It's only very rarely that we have someone that doesn't have an established pattern, and we can see it in the context of self-medication, adjusting one's consciousness, whatever. But at the bottom, in my view, it's always trying to recreate a mind-body state that was once okay. But that mind-body state is very hard to achieve in adult life. It was once felt wonderful to be bonded, merged, oozing with mother in a wonderful way. And whether one was bonded with a hyperactive mother, so your drug of choice is coffee, or cocaine, or whether your mother had other dimensions, you choose different drugs. And of course, we're coming out with all sorts of new wonderful addictions on the internet now. More to come, I'm sure. So that the symbiotic or the borderline transference represents in our real life now some way that we first achieved love. And if you want to know what your own borderline syndrome is, ask someone who lives with you. They will tell you. She melts when blah, 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 blah. She goes off the deep end whenever this happens, you know. So our own splits, in terms of the things that drive us absolutely mad, that, you know, the screaming, yelling, manic crazy, or depressed, or the things that are wonderful, soft, soothing, loving, it goes back to that first love bond. And in our deepest sexual experiences, both good and bad, the same kind of thing can be said. Well, so far, all I've done is review what we already know, which is that we have a set of developmental metaphors to try to describe some of the range of possibilities of human relationship experience. And so when we listen in the psychotherapy situation, we're waiting to see what the relationship promises, how the vibrations of the relationship are set up, what sort of demands are going to be made of us, and we're going to be looking for how those patterns show up in every aspect of that person's life, and we're going to be trying to find ways of representing that. The transference that's taken us the longest to really try to get to where we could talk about is going to be this lowest level transference. It's a transference where psychotic states emanate from. And so we know that we've got two major classes of psychotic states, the thought disorders and the mood disorders. And if we think about that for just a minute, we can think that if psychotic states, functional ones, not necessarily genetic or constitutional ones, but the ones that we assume to be our functional states, they're going to go back to this early period, probably the last trimester before birth and the first 3 or 4 months of life, somewhere in that time period. And there's going to be several sets of experiences that we're assuming now that that did not go well for the child. If we later have a thought disorder, we're assuming that something in the primary cause-effect relationships of organizing one's channels to the world didn't work out well. That is, babies are busy learning before birth and after birth about the way things are. And if in some way or another, every time the baby is expecting something else happens, or there's a chaos in it all, your fundamental template for cause and effect expectations simply isn't set up right. The same way with the moods. We know that the moods, affects, basically have biological roots. You can go to any newborn nursery and see a wide range of affective potentials at birth. But what we also know is that the regulation of the moods and the affects is a function of the bonding experience. That is, as the child's body states come into contact with its love objects, with his mother, its parents, whatever the caregiving environment has to offer, slowly but surely, the affect states come to resonate within the context of the relationship. So again, not that we don't have biologically or constitutionally determined manic and depressive states, But I think that a large group, if not the majority of things that we see in our offices on a daily basis, they're going to be affect states that never came under the control of the symbiosis, or that came under the control of the symbiosis according to a certain slant, a certain set of rules. So all I want to do is to focus on this level in which the primary task of the fetus or the neonate is to organize sensible channels to the environment. Channels for nurturance, soothing, evacuation, ways of making sense of what is. And we hope that that goes well. But we do know that there are many circumstances that a fetus or a neonate can be subjected to that are intrusive, that provide impingements. Donald Winnicott, the British pediatrician, psychoanalyst, used birth trauma as a metaphor for talking about any kind of impingement that could happen in this early developmental phase. And here's Winnicott's argument. He said, I've seen hundreds of babies delivered. I see no reason to suppose that birth in and of itself is traumatic. The baby is ready, the canal is there, the mechanisms to open the canal, the baby can locomote. There's no reason why birth cannot be a timely, beautiful, inspiring event. However, if the birth process is unusually prolonged or unusually intense, or there's some kind of complication that brings the baby's world to a stop, then we have an impingement, and we can indeed have birth trauma. So Winnicott's notion, as Bob mentioned this morning, was that in utero, in those earliest months of life, until the baby begins to look towards the bonding situation, we have a baby that just has a sense of going on being. And so long as that sense of going on being occurs, there's not necessarily any occasion for the baby to begin thinking or reacting to the environment. Baby gets hungry, food is sent for. And you can ask any mother how about the power of that little fetus living in your body. And she'll tell you, I'm all the time racing down to Lucky's to get something else that baby is telling me to go for. So the mothers are very well aware of the power of a baby to say what it needs and to force the mother's body into doing what baby needs. And we certainly know after babies are born, they have a very robust way of signaling to us. So that babies come into the world prepared to put out a demand, and if they put out the demand and the demand is responded to in a timely and effective way, then the going on being process occurs. But if there's an impingement, something unexpected, something hurtful, somewhat traumatic, then the baby begins to have to react. And it is that reaction to trauma that forms the first template for thought. Thought arises, as far as we can tell, out of frustration. If the baby had not had that impingement, by the time the perceptual apparatus began to quicken, second, third, fourth month, the environment began to become more responsive. We began to see perception, motility. We began to see all the ego functions evolving in response to reaching out, making contact with the environment. So it is going to be the impingement that sets up what is usually experienced later as some kind of a persecutory anxiety. That is, that when you have had trauma in infancy, you're always surveying the world for that kind of trauma again. That has a disadvantage because you're all the time seeing terrible things coming at you that aren't really coming at you. And more important than that, you're so busy doing that, you miss terrible things coming at you that you could have seen if you weren't so busy preoccupied looking for others. And when we see people who have had a whole lifetime of various kinds of abuse, and you begin to realize it goes all the way back to an infantile trauma, you begin to realize that that those things are true. That one, they're always surveying, always looking for where the next abuse is going to come from, but of course it always comes from just where they're not looking. Because they're so focused in a certain way that they're so terrified of that they don't use good judgment about other places, and then they find themselves being abused in a new and different way. Now, as we try to think about those developmental ideas, realizing that there's a lot of inference here, we're really targeting the psychotherapy situation and how the scars left from infantile trauma might reappear and make themselves known to us in that. Let me use one more developmental metaphor to show you the kind of things we're going to expect. If I'm a baby, imagine that I'm born with 1,000 invisible tendrils, reaching out in all different directions, trying to find the world, trying to find that which I have to thrive. And as has already been said, infant research has demonstrated, if about 30% of those tendrils glom onto somebody, I'm going to be able to survive fairly well. So parents are always relieved to hear 30%, to know that if you're there 30% of the time and meet and manage those needs in a very comfortable way, and the other times the baby's not traumatized, we're going to have a fairly good development. If I reach and reach and reach and reach, and nobody's there, I wither. And babies who do this all the time, for long periods of time, literally die of marasmus, a condition we hardly know in this society because our research has taught us that babies have to be stimulated. If I reach and reach and reach, and just when I'm reaching, looking, excited, I get burned, slapped, hit. So there's a tremendous contraction, a constriction. And perhaps, as Bob was saying, it might be in my jaw, throat, legs, joints, anywhere in my body might be the constriction. But in both cases, whether I'm reaching and withering or reaching and getting burned, at a neurological level, a message is set up. Don't do that again. Never reach that way again. Never go in that way again. And so whole parts of personality fail to evolve because the baby learned not to extend so as to connect, to see, to move, to live, to feel, all of the things that babies are good at doing when they connect and bond. Now, it's my view that the organizing transference doesn't belong simply to people we like to label psychotic, but that it's universal. That out of those 70% of the tendrils that didn't make it, it left a scar in all of us. Now, perhaps the scar was minor, limited, and we had enough good things that we went ahead and developed. But by the time we're in therapy for a while, that scar may show up as something. What does it usually feel like? We all know what the scar feels like because we'll be in a relationship with someone, perhaps someone we care about a great deal, perhaps a child, perhaps a mentor, but someone, and an emotional relationship, intimacy begins to evolve and to develop. And the relationship is going very well, and suddenly inside of us, from God knows where, we begin to feel ourselves backpedaling, moving away from the excitement, the intimacy that has good possibilities for us. And we don't know why. All of us in the course of a lifetime have had various people who are close to us point to us in some way and say, the trouble with you is you don't know how to be intimate. It's happened to all of us. Why do you pull away just when we get close? Right? So I believe that this early transference experience of being afraid of intimate contact is universal, although it affects every one of us differently and to different degrees, but where we know about it is in our closest relationships. And when we go to our psychotherapist, we want to set up a trust relationship, and if we go there for a long period of time, the trust begins to occur, and it's only a matter of time before this very deep level of transference begins to make itself known. We want to pull away. We want out. We don't want to talk about this. We don't want to have this kind of a feeling. I don't want to go there today. If that early scar was horrible, then if you're my therapist and I begin to get back in there, you're saying to me, come to me, we'll re-experience in our relationship whatever you have to experience. And so I, very much afraid, began to approach. But at some point, just when you're very happy because something's cooking here, and you say, at last, it's taken months, years to get this guy to where he could smile or laugh or be comfortable or tell me that he liked me or whatever it was, and you're happy that you got it. Right then, suddenly I move, shift the conversation, call and cancel all future appointments, whatever. Every therapist in this room has had this happen plenty of times. Sometimes it's, you know that it comes from a level of pervasive deep disturbance. Other times it's a small part. There's just a small pocket, if you will, of an organizing transference. But it manifests itself in terms of the terror of actually being in a relationship, a connected relationship. When I try to think about what that early connection is like, Frances Tustin helped us with that. She studied autistic children in England for 30 years. And in one of her later papers, called The Rhythm of Safety, we heard her read it when we were in London, and she said, I had forgotten completely until I recently saw my grandniece nursing her baby that the nipple is as active as the mouth in the nursing process. Two beings with a need come together, make contact, and begin a little bit of movement. And two bodies relax. In a few minutes, somebody moves, and there's this tension, and readjust until finally the rhythm begins again, the sucking rhythm that both are participating in. And two bodies relax again. The rhythm of safety, she called it, the fundamental paradigm for human contact. But what happens if every time you moved into a rhythm of safety in a trust relationship of infancy, something happened? Then you're terrified of ever going there again. Now, if you weren't damaged too badly, you might have certain areas that you'd go ahead and develop, and so you might go ahead and bond, go up the developmental ladder and develop more or less all right, but those scars would be there. They'd be waiting for you in therapy, and we don't know what kind of scars they were. And the trauma could be focal or strain. We know about focal trauma, just huge, horrible trauma of a baby. Baby's got to have surgery. In the hospital for 14 days, the parents can't stay. I mean, you could name lots of them. Incubator. Adoption. It's trauma. My mother, I've been with her 9 months and suddenly she's not here. This other mother smells bad. I don't like her. It's always a trauma, no matter how well it's handled. So we have a trauma that may be focal, that leaves a certain scarring. But the ones that are more difficult are what Masood Khan has called cumulative strain trauma. Masood Khan was an Indian prince who went from India to study psychoanalysis in Great Britain. He became a training analyst, and in a 1962 paper reported on cumulative strain trauma, indicating that there are many infants who live in an environment or with a family or with a mother or with a handicap, with something which is a strain on that baby. So that hour after hour, day after day, week after week, the baby lives under a certain adaptive strain, a strain we wouldn't like any baby to have to live under. But the strain of having to adapt to a certain circumstance that wouldn't be a circumstance the baby would choose leaves a trauma, a scar, just as bad as if we'd had a major focal trauma. But we may not know it at the time. How many times have we been in the shopping mall, the supermarket, wherever, and we see some atrocious scene, and you wonder, what's happening in that baby's mind? Is that baby going to be okay? Does this mother let that happen all the time? And you begin to say, my God, There's job security for us so long as that kind of mothering goes on, huh? Okay. We don't have to be worried about going out of a job. We may have to deal with managed care and lawsuits, but there's plenty of people coming that have been through lots of trauma. And so in the psychotherapy situation, the relationship, the person is very afraid. Many months may go by before we begin to sense a little bit of real life. Often when I'm consulting with a therapist about this, I'll hear the story, and the person's been coming for 3 years. She arrives on time. She's always there. She's always got a check written. We always talk about this and this and this. I mean, in a way, it's kind of boring, but I know she wants to be there. I don't know what she's getting out of it. I don't know where this therapy is going, but she's devoted and she's there. What's happening? And we begin to realize that just some fundamental element of safety is slowly evolving. This is a person who's never been safe in any interpersonal environment. And so she's got to spend a lot of time just being there, telling about this, doing that, doing a little testing, whatever, just to feel like I'm not going to get hurt if I stay in this room. And then I ask the question, well, but is there any sign of life anywhere here? No, not, well, wait. And then suddenly, every now and then she tells me about such and such, and she laughs a little. I say, go for it. We have to pay attention to the client, where the client will experience just a bit of that movement. If you're going to nurse a baby, you're sensitive to where the baby can be touched, how the baby can be positioned, so that the sucking movement begins. Well, but that's not therapy doing that or talking about that. I say, who are you to say what her therapy is about? She knows that this will begin movement between you and her, that you and she will begin to feel contact in this way. My favorite one of this was a quite skilled therapist who had many years of experience, was reporting on a case like this, and I finally got to the question of, well, where is there a little bit of life? And there wasn't any. And I said, well, you'll have to wait. You'll have to wait because she's still not safe to be there. But I said, at some point, you'll begin to see just a little bit of life. The eyes may be a little bit brighter, maybe a little bit of a smile, a little bit of something going, and go for it, Like the M&Ms have got to drop down in the slot machine right at the moment where there's the slightest bit of life, because you've got to go for it, reinforcement, seduce it, pull it, because you're dealing with someone who cannot reach out. You're dealing with a mouth that can't quite go around a nipple and hold it and suck. She says, well, there is one other thing that I didn't tell you about. Oh! She said, well, it didn't seem too therapeutic, so I didn't think I'd mention it. Oh! Well, we're both musicians. Oh! And it turns out, kind of towards the end of the hour, the beginning of the hour, they both found that they were musicians. They loved certain composers. They both played the piano. And so they began exchanging cassettes. Now, I don't know whether Brent wants to, defend anybody that's playing footsie with cassettes, but they were doing cassettes back and forth. And then sheet music. And then they would make recordings of their playing for each other and sit and listen to it. So here this whole realm of really beautiful, intuitive connecting was going on that this therapist knew. She was a mother of 4. She knew how to connect. She knew what music was about. But it didn't occur to her that she was really feeling it was a little bit of a dual relationship, passing sheet music back and forth and listening to each other's piano recordings. Well, I don't know exactly how we'll defend that kind of thing when it ever comes up, but it's the way that we begin to connect. And then, of course, what are we watching for? Once we begin to get the connection, whether it's around movies, I have 2 patients I'm reading with now. We pass books back and forth. There are people who, they're very different people for very different reasons, but as we read these books and talk about them, that's the way we're able to communicate. Neither of these 2 people could just come in and tell me about themselves. But we laugh, we go over passages, we talk about why this biography is different from that biography and so forth, and so we allow the rhythm of safety to begin in that particular way. And I know that every one of you can go down your practice over the years that you've been in practice and point to these cases where you did these strange things that you'd be almost ashamed to tell anybody that you did, but that you somehow knew were right. And then you're where my dream started. At the division between the high road that tells us how we're supposed to do psychotherapy and the low road that takes us into boundary violations. But you know that intimacy is where it's at. We have to promote intimacy, and how are we going to do it? And that's the conflict we're in. Therapists again and again and again come to case conferences and say, I'm a little embarrassed talking about this case, but, and so they go into what it is that's been going on. Well, what it is that's been going on is just as intuitive and beautiful as reading biographies together or exchanging cassette tapes of one another's piano playing. Again, I think what Brandt would tell us is we got to document it all the way along and make clear what, when, why, and where we're doing it and what's coming out of it. That's the important thing, not what it is we're doing it. I conducted one whole piece of therapy around the game of pool. There's several good pool movies I had to go see. I had to go to pool rooms until I got the whole feel. Do you know there's a whole subculture of pool people in Orange County? You know, ride motorcycles, they have fights in parking lots with knives and drugs and motorcycle mamas and all this. Now, I didn't do it with my patient. I didn't do that. But he was one of the captains of one of the pool tournaments and so forth. There was stuff I never had the slightest idea about. So I found one of the little pool rooms and began hanging out and having beer and talking to people until I began to sense a whole world that I really didn't know anything about. And then we began talking about the game of pool. I mean, I thought there were, 12 little balls? How many? 15, thank you. 15 little balls that you bounce around the table and make them go to stupid little pockets. Well, it's not that way. This is another whole world with very sophisticated things. And, so then I had to go see The Hustler, okay, which some of the most fantastic pool shots ever done are filmed in. And slowly but surely, his addiction to marijuana began to come to light and what it was all about and how it related to his mother and why his mother was the one that made the referral of a 25-year-old young man. And the reason he had to be in psychotherapy was because she was having heart palpitations. Now, we worked this out and her palpitations subsided as a result of pool, okay? Hard to explain to the judge, okay? You all can tell cases like that. You've seen strange, wonderful, beautiful things happen, and you know that you're always at that area where you're really worried, and that's why I think the things that Brandt had to tell us today are so very important. Talking with colleagues, documenting, getting consultations, doing all of those things so that when you're in that, when you take the little low garden path down through the bog, you're going to make certain that we don't get merged and we don't lose boundaries, but we're going to somehow find some place to where the high road and the low road begin to balance out. The last point I want to make is how do we work this organizing or psychotic transference? We can see that the original damage was done when the child was reaching out, extending, looking for connection that was traumatically disrupted. And so the terror of staying connected, of establishing a rhythm of safety, is wired in to the fear of connecting, the terror of connecting. Very different from our borderlines. At the borderline level, we have bonded people. They're terrified of abandonment. These people are terrified of connecting. Now they talk a big game of abandonment. You're not giving me enough, you're not doing it right. But as you begin to examine the you're not doing it right, you're not giving me enough, and whether it's through wrist slashing or midnight phone calls or whatever else it is, as you begin to study it, you realize these are not connecting overtures, these are disconnecting overtures. This isn't abandonment. These are ways of making certain that the relationship doesn't take. There's a big difference between the motivation, one person crying abandonment, realizing that you're not doing it quite right, but you and that person can find a way to get together, where they do have a capacity for bonding, and another whole set of people who cry, scream, and yell like colicky babies, making you really want to kill the baby rather than to connect and pick up with the baby. So many of these cries and demands for more, 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 you're abandoning me, you're not doing it right, you're not giving it enough, they are really ways of driving the mother away rather than drawing the mother near. Slowly, we seduce a bond, whether through music, pool, reading, talking, being together, silence, whatever, until a connection begins to evolve. But we're watching for something. We're lying in wait. Anybody can seduce somebody into a relationship. The skill of a therapist is watching for the moment of terror. And it may not be altogether obvious at first. When the person begins to come in and begins to feel the bonding dance, begins to feel the connection begin to take, they will automatically change the subject, move away. They've been doing this for a whole lifetime, avoiding connections. They know how to do it very skillfully, and they always do it with a juicy bone. They throw you some other, really nice therapy material about my mother, or another memory I'm just having about back on that satanic altar, or multiple personalities are my favorite one, where Victor comes in and he's busy going on and on about something, and the therapist says, oh yes, you must feel such and such, and there's this real empathic connection, and suddenly little Victoria, age 4, appears, and I say to the therapist, how did you understand that? Well, Victor had some things to tell me he'd never told me before, and I heard them, and he felt heard, and he felt the empathic connection, and so then that allowed little Victoria to appear, so that now I can be told something else. I said, I didn't hear it that way. I heard that you connected, and that Victor couldn't stand the connection, and he broke it by shifting into another personality. And when you look very close at the detailed notes of multiple personalities, you will find invariably the switch occurs immediately following a connection. It's a disconnection. Staying connected is too terrifying. And so on this road of life, the superhighway of life that we have, where we're caught between the high road of structure, ethics, law, and what we're supposed to do, and blocked by all of that, and terrified of being seduced into some sort of bog of perversity and merger, we're trying to cut through a middle road. We've got to pay attention to the kinds of transferences that people are bringing. And when we think about the fiasco that I told you about that happened on Quinta, when one intelligence, a therapist wishes to reach out innocuously and try to make contact with another, we don't know what the other person is going to experience as hurtful and damaging. We do not know. And so for us to assume that a standard therapeutic technique, or something that certainly seems harmless or friendly or nice to us, is not hurtful and damaging to the other, is to be naive and destructive. Thank you.